Welcome to the Collins Center for the Arts. My name is Jonathan Rubin. I am the director of the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center at the University of Maine. Thank you very much to our ROTC, and thank you very much for the university's group, Renaissance. Welcome to the Margaret Chase Smith Lectureship in Public Affairs. We are honored today to have Senator King present on Maine and climate change, the view from Greenland. I would like to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the University of Maine Foundation, the Cohen Institute for Leadership and Public Service, the Cultural Affairs Fund, and the Division of Student Life. I would especially like to acknowledge the Margaret Chase Smith Foundation for its major contributions to an endowment fund to help support the Senator Margaret Chase Smith Lectureship on Public Affairs. Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center is a nonpartisan, independent research unit of the University of Maine. Created in 1990, was named to continue the legacy of Margaret Chase Smith, the senator who is known as a national model of civic discourse and integrity. And I know we all value that today more than ever. And I would like to say that the Smith Center, the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center, we work on public policy issues and processes to help with state and national decision making. We leverage the resources of the University of Maine and the University of Maine system, and our goal is to be the premier research unit on campus and in the state. And I would now like to introduce the University of Maine president, Dr. Susan Hunter. Dr. Susan Hunter became president of the University of Maine July 7th, 2014. Prior to starting her appointment as Maine's first woman president, she began her full-time career at the University of Maine in 1991 as a faculty member in the Department of Biological Sciences. At University of Maine, her administrative positions included chair of the Department of Biological Sciences, associate provost and dean for undergraduate education, and 5 years as executive vice president for academic affairs and provost. Her research was supported by the National Institute for Health and the National Science Foundation. She received her PhD in psychology from Pennsylvania State University. Dr. Hunter.
So welcome everyone to the University of Maine, and thank you for joining us today for the Senator Margaret Chase Smith Lectureship on Public Affairs. The Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center and this lectureship continue an important function of Maine's land-grant and sea-grant university, engaging the university and communities across Maine by promoting involvement in our government and policymaking, and stimulating connections between our faculty and student research and academic work and the work of government. Margaret Chase Smith was known for both her independence and her civility, and her influence in the state of Maine is still very strong. She was the first woman elected to both houses of the U.S. Congress and served for 32 years. She held an all-time voting record in the Senate until 1981 with 2,941 consecutive roll call votes. 52 years ago, at the Republican National Convention, Senator Smith became the first woman to be nominated for President of the United States. There are many wonderful assignments that come with the job of being president of UMaine, and introducing today's speaker is one of them. I've known Senator King for a number of years, and it is both a pleasure and an honor to have him join us on campus to deliver this lecture. Since 2013, Angus King has served as Maine's first independent U.S. Senator. Senator King sits on 5 committees: Rules and Administration, Intelligence, Armed Services, Budget, and Energy and Natural Resources. He is also a former 2-term Maine governor. Senator King is a strong supporter of the University of Maine and our work that makes a difference in Maine and beyond. That work includes our internationally recognized research in climate change. Today, Senator King is here to talk about the global problem that is on our doorstep. We appreciate him sharing his perspectives on Maine and climate change, the view from Greenland. Please join me in a warm UMaine welcome for Senator Angus King.
Thank you. It's great. It's wonderful to be here. The last time I was in this room, I must say it was quite an evening with the head of the National Park Service. talking about the National Monument, and it was a packed house, and I'm proud to say that everyone in the house that wanted to speak got to say their piece. We had proponents over here and opponents over here. We don't have to do that today, I hope. I want to start with a couple of stories about Margaret Chase Smith. I got to know her after she left the Senate, and she was living in Skowhegan in retirement, and I then worked for public broadcasting, and public broadcasting said, let's do a documentary about Margaret Chase Smith. So I went up and spent the day, wrote her, a note and said, could we do this? She said yes. Went up and spent the day with her, and she was very gracious. This was just in preparation. And when I went back, I said to Mary, I feel a little awkward about this because I worked for Bill Hathaway when he ran against her in 1972 and defeated her, and this doesn't exactly feel right. So I wrote her a note and said, Dear Senator Smith, I feel I need to honestly tell you that I worked for Bill Hathaway. This was in the 80s, 10 or 15 years later, that I worked for Bill Hathaway when he ran against you and then later in the Senate, and I hope it's okay and we can continue to do this project. I wish I had saved the letter I got back. It was vintage Margaret Chase Smith. It said, Dear Angus King. That was one of her characteristics, both names. Dear Angus King, it is perfectly all right with me that you once worked for Mr. Hathaway. Yours sincerely, Margaret Chase Smith. That was it. Allegedly, the legend in Washington is, and I never could verify this, that somebody wrote her a very intemperate, irate letter, and she wrote him back and said, Dear Mr. So-and-so, you should be aware that some fool is writing terrible letters using your name. I myself have not quite gotten to the point where I have the nerve to do that. A couple of stories about her. We did the program, which was fascinating to interview her, and she debated Eleanor Roosevelt in the Eisenhower-Stevenson election in '52, I think it was. I mean, we had this wonderful footage. But anyway, Mary and I became friends, and we'd go up to see her and visit with her in Skowhegan. A couple of funny stories. One was she was taking us on a tour of the little museum. And by the way, if you're in that area, the Margaret Chase Smith library is a gem. It's really fascinating. And one of the great things is there's a room where the entire room is lined with academic hoods that she had earned honorary degrees, and this was a person who never went to college. And all these honorary degrees. But anyway, one day we were walking by, and there was this big map of Maine, and she pointed, she said, see Harpswell and Small Point and St. George, and she was pointing to all the peninsulas. She said, I once went to President Eisenhower in the 50s and said, don't you think it would be a good idea to build an interstate highway touching all the points of the Maine coast, out over the water? She turned to me and said, boy, am I glad he thought it was a terrible idea. But I don't know. I'd never heard that story. And the final one was just a wonderful story. We were chatting, and every year, a couple of times, well, I got two. A couple of times a year, she would go and read at the local elementary school, which is named the Margaret Chase Smith School. So she would go and read, and after reading, she would ask the kids if they had any questions. And this one little girl one year raised her hand and said, yes, how do you happen to be named after our school? And the other one was we would always go to lunch at Cherrier's, which used to be Whittemore's, and she always paid. And so one year I got up and pretended to be going to the men's room and went and paid. And apparently she was so mad she almost had the cashier fired who let me pay. So the next year I tried the same trick, and the cashier said, I'm sorry, Senator Smith came in yesterday and paid. Okay. Here's why I want to talk about climate change and to lead into what I want to talk about. I have found in working at public policy now for 20 plus years that it's relatively easy to find solutions and what the policy should be if you have widespread understanding of the facts. If everybody knows the facts, you can the resolution, the policy becomes almost self-evident. if you don't have a shared understanding of the facts, getting to a policy resolution is almost impossible. And indeed, without delving into the recent election or American politics, one of the problems today is that we all go to get our information from different sources so that we all have different facts. When I was young, we all got our facts from the same person. Who? Walter Cronkite. That's what you said, Walter Cronkite. Everybody in America learned what they needed to know from Walter Cronkite. Now, and I learned recently, there's a term for this called confirmation bias, where you tend to go to the source of information that already confirms what you think. And the problem with that is, as I say, if people have different facts, it's almost impossible to get to a solution. So what I want to present today is some firsthand observations about climate change, its implications, where we're headed, and why we need to do something. Last spring, I think, February or March, I had breakfast with the Commandant of the Coast Guard. It was a kind of courtesy. He wanted to meet me and chat because obviously we have a lot of interaction with the Coast Guard. And he mentioned during the breakfast that he was going late in the summer, to Greenland. And I honestly don't remember whether he invited me or whether I invited myself. But in any case, I went with him to Greenland in late August. And it was an extraordinary trip. The focus was twofold. One was what is happening to Greenland in terms of the climate, and the second was national security. As Sue mentioned, I'm on the Armed Services and Intelligence Committee, so about half of my time in Washington is spent on national security, and there are huge national security issues in the Arctic. We met with the Danish Joint Arctic Command. Greenland is an interesting country. It's mostly independent, but it's still Denmark handles their international affairs and defense. So the military people that were there were Danish, and we spent a good day and a half with them talking about challenges in the Arctic, both in terms of national security and things like search and rescue as the Arctic Ocean is opening up. One of the things I realized when I was up there was that everybody says, well, the Arctic ice is melting and Greenland ice sheet is melting and therefore we can sail through and it'll all be clear. The opposite is true actually right now because there are way more icebergs than there were before. Because of the amount of melting that's going on, the icebergs are larger and more numerous and more dangerous. So that was part of the focus on the trip. Also with us on the trip was a guy named Bob Carell, who spends part of his time here in Maine in the town of Weld, Maine. By the way, there's a town near Weld called Temple. And I learned from Temple to never exaggerate or utter even a casual untruth, because I met a guy from Temple once, and he was an older man, and I said, where are you from? He said, Temple. He said, you ever been there? I said, well, I'm not sure I've been there, but I think I've been through it. He said, no, you weren't. Temple is a dead end. You don't go through Temple. You either go to it or not. So I learned from that, don't fudge it, you know. You haven't been to Temple? Say, I've never been to Temple. In any case, Temple is near Weld. Bob Carell's from Weld. Bob Carell is a world-renowned climate scientist, particularly dealing with the Arctic and the Antarctic. In fact, I could list all his degrees and that, but to me, the most impressive thing, he has a peninsula in Antarctica named for him. That's pretty cool, when you have a geographic place named for you. And then a guy named John Englander, who's written a very interesting book called High Tide on Main Street. And so they were with us on this trip. So what I want to talk about is what's going on in Greenland, why it's significant for us, and I've got some slides. Let's start, and this slide, as it builds out, basically tells you all you need to know about climate change and what we're dealing with. So here's the first thing. This is 450,000 years Each graph is the same scale, the same number of years, everything else. So this is 450,000 years of CO2 concentrated in the atmosphere. And as you can see, it varies. And sometimes when you talk to people who are skeptical of climate change science, they say, well, yeah, it varies. Look, it goes up and down. It's always done that. Well, sort of. If you'll notice, it varies between 180 and maybe 300 parts per million, but the average is in this 250 to 270 parts per million, except for now. We're at 400. It hasn't been at 400 for something like 5 million years. 400 is uncharted territory. That's, 25% higher than the peaks along here, and almost, almost 100% higher than the average. So this is where we are right now. 2 years ago, we reached 400 for 1 month. Last year, I believe we were at 400 12 months. One of the things I'm going to be talking about is speed and acceleration. Okay, so that's the first chart. And you see that chart and say, okay, Angus, CO2, it's going up. Who cares? We breathe it all the time. Plants breathe it in. It's part of our atmosphere. More CO2 doesn't seem, I'm not choking, what's the problem? Here's the problem. This is 450,000 years of temperature. Do you notice any similarities between those two graphs? There's a direct relationship between down, down, up, up, down, up, down. They're the same. They're essentially the same. In other words, there's a direct correlation between CO2 and temperature. CO2 goes up, temperature goes up. CO2 goes down, temperature goes down. And, here's where we are. Now, one of the most interesting things is that if you see this pattern and you see it going up, the pattern is it should be starting to go down. You see, we should have been headed into a long, slow cooling, but instead, this is what's happening up here, and temperature is starting to catch up to it. Okay, so, again, so what? Gets a little warmer. We can take our jackets off earlier in April or May. What difference does that make? Well, here's another. That's sea level. Again, do you notice a correlation? CO2 goes up, temperature goes up, sea level goes up. And then, if you put them all together, wait a minute, that's all three of them. That's about what you need to know in terms of science. And by the way, I really can't understand why this is a partisan issue. Those of you who are of my generation remember that the earliest people who were champions on environmental issues in Maine were all Republicans. Not all, but most of them. Hoddy Hildreth, Joe Sewell from down the street, David Huber, Ken McLeod. Those were people who were Republicans who were strong advocates of environmental protection and environmental legislation. Somehow, this has become a partisan issue, and I honestly don't understand exactly why. Because this is science. We don't have fierce debates in the U.S. Senate about what temperature water boils. I think it's 212. No, it's 180. We don't have that discussion. Or what's the speed of light? It's 186,000 miles a second. No, it's not. It's 200,000. No, it's 150. These are numbers. Pi, 3.1416, everywhere in the universe. Same thing. This is just plain old science. And that's what we're talking about. So the question is, okay, you put these three things together, and you see the obvious correlation. So then the question is, why is this happening? Because another argument you hear is, this is just a natural cycle of things. Well, if it is a natural cycle of things, it's an awfully curious coincidence that it happens to have happened in the last 150 to 200 years when we started burning fossil fuels and putting carbon into the atmosphere in a very serious way. And here's a way to think about this. When you burn coal or burn oil or burn gas, this is carbon that has been underground for millions of years. In other words, it's sequestered. That's the only time you'll hear me use the word sequester in a positive way. It's locked. It's not in the atmosphere. Trees, the amount of CO2 in the forest is in the atmosphere. Trees die, they rot, the CO2 goes up, they grow, they absorb CO2, or they absorb carbon. But this is new carbon, and that's what's happening. So the question is, why? Well, one way to look is to go back to that first slide of CO2, and you see it. I don't have a slide on this, but I've got my little card. I carry these cards around, and I bought a bunch of them. I brought a bunch of them. I'll leave them here, and people can get them at my office. It's called Climate Change in a Nutshell. And on this side is CO2, and it's actually 800,000. I got into debate with one of my colleagues, and he gave like 5,000 years and showed, not that. I said, I'll see your 5,000 and raise you 800. And handed him my card. Anyway, it dinks around between 180 and 250, 300 parts per million for 800,000 years, and then suddenly, mysteriously, in 1810, it starts to go up. Wasn't volcanoes, wasn't storms in the Pacific. That was when we started to burn fossil fuel. And then the other side is the graph of correlation between temperature and CO2. So let's look at this. If we can run this, don't start it yet, Mr. Tech Guy. This is CO2 emissions from 1750 to 2010. And we got to back it up. Can you back up to 1700? You're up to 1909. Wait a minute. Oops, stop. Okay, we're starting in the 1700. This is global total annual emissions of CO2. You with me? The year over here. Oh, I forgot I've got my nifty device. This is the year, 1768, and it starts a little earlier, and this number is 2 something in the earlier. Total annual emissions, 3.35 tons, okay? Annual, in a year. All right, you with me? All right, let's run it. Here we go. $1,700's 5, it's gone from 3 to 5, now it's 6. 1800, 9, 10, 13, 14. We're in the 1820s now. Starting to burn a lot of coal. 1850, we're up to 800. 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, 900, 9,000. I don't know why it wants to jump back to 1909, but it's gone from about 2 million tons a year to 7,000. 2 to 7,000. That's what we're talking about in terms of volume. That's what's happening. All right, let's go. This is another graphic representation of temperature. So let's start this one. This starts in the 1800s, and the temperature's in a circle. In the 1850s, 1860s, each it's a month of the year, and it's going around, and this is temperature. There are two things we learn from that. One is something's happening, and number two, did you notice that it was accelerating? That as it gets bigger, that means the temperature is going up more each year, and it got bigger faster at the end. Can we run that one again just so you can watch that? The bigger the circle, the higher the temperature. So you can see it's changing gradually back in the 1800s, early 1900s. Now we're in the 50s, 70s, 80s. Now look what's happening. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about accelerating change, and the word accelerating is a very important concept. Now again, the question is, what do we care about this? Why is this a practical, who cares? Well, here's why we care. I mean, there are lots of reasons, but I'm going to focus mostly on sea level. This was a huge learning for me on the trip to Greenland. I don't know about you, but I always think of the ocean as being sort of a fixed asset. You walk out, you look out at Bar Harbor, and it's there, and it's the way it's always been, and that's just life. There are certain verities, and one of them is the ocean is the level that it is. The trouble is, it's only been the level that it is during the short span of human history, about 8,000 years. That's a millisecond in world history, and the ocean. We happen to have settled this country and moved to Maine and built bridges and roads and everything else during one of the relatively stable periods of sea level. Here's what was stunning to me. Here we go. I'll just go back. I don't have to go back that far. Go back about 15,000 years, and the ocean right off of our coast was 300 feet shallower than it is now. I found that an amazing fact that I hadn't really realized. 300 feet, not 3 inches or 30 inches, 300 feet. And what this is, 24,000 years ago, where we are standing today was covered by 2 miles of ice. 10,000 feet of ice. That's where all the water was. The water was in the glaciers that covered most of North America, and that's why the ocean was shallower than it is. And what you're seeing here is as the glaciers melted, the water goes up. I thought of doing a demo, but I forgot, frankly. But if you have a drink, glass of water, and you have ice already in it, and the ice melts, the water level doesn't change. The water's already taken account of that ice. And that's why the melting of the ice in the Arctic Ocean is not a contributor to ocean sea level rise, because the ice is already in the water. Think about it. But if you have your glass of water with a couple of pieces of ice, and you put another piece of ice in, what happens? Water level goes up. That's what this is. You see, this is ice that wasn't in the ocean, it was on land. And as that ice melts, you see the sea level going up. This is today. You see this, here we are, this is 8,000 years. You see, this looks stable. But if you lived here, you'd say, holy smoke, what's happening? And this is an interesting period. The meltwater pulse 1A, it's called. And if you go down and do the calculation, the sea level rose about 1 foot a decade during that period. That's about 100 feet of sea level rise in 1,000 years. About 1 foot a decade. You'll hear that number again in a few minutes. Here's a wonderful picture we found. That's the Gulf of Maine 8,000 years ago. And this is what's called Georges Banks, which is now a great fishing ground. But you can see it was out of the water. And here, can you see Cape Cod? Cape Cod is sort of buried right here. And all of this it was land, and this was land. And in fact, I first learned this from a wonderful guy that works at the Darling Center named Bob Stenick. Many of you probably know him. He's one of the world's experts on lobsters and ocean ecology. You can, if you dive on Georgia's banks, you can find submerged tree trunks and mastodon teeth. And as Bob told me, mastodons were notoriously poor swimmers. This was land. So the point I'm trying to make here is things change. What we have and what we know is not the way things necessarily have to always be. So let's talk about Greenland. Greenland is like the glaciers in the sense that it's a huge area of ice on land. It's on an island. And what's happening, it's a huge amount of ice that's locked up. The two biggest sources, I think something like 90% of all the fresh water in the world are in Greenland, in the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet, okay? So what's happening is, for the first time in, I don't know, 10,000, 100,000 years, the Greenland ice sheet's starting to melt. And it's melting faster. And there's 20 feet of sea level rise just in the Greenland ice sheet. The Greenland ice sheet melts and all goes. It's not going to go anytime soon, but that's 20 feet. Antarctica is 212 feet worth of sea level rise in Antarctica. That's starting to melt too. So we went to Greenland. And this is, we flew over the ice sheet in a helicopter, landed, walked around. I took this shot. This is a little piece of the helicopter looking down, and this is a feature called a moulin. I'd never heard of a moulin. This is a feature called a moulin, and a moulin is a big hole in the ice. That's maybe the size of a football field. And then going into the moulin is what looks like a river, beautiful light blue, and that's meltwater, and it goes down, and this is a visualization of what it looks like. This is the ice lake with a moulin in the bottom, and the water is going all the way down. This is about 2 miles of ice to the bottom and lubricating the underneath of the ice sheet and the ground and accelerating the movement of the ice sheet toward the ocean. And this is something that is happening. And when we flew over this, the two scientists, one of whom I think had been to Greenland 20 times, said, "Holy smoke, I've never seen one that big." He'd never seen one as big as the one that we flew over. Here's another similar shot. I didn't take this. I got this from Instagram. I wrote the guy and said, "Do you mind if I use your picture?" He's a National Geographic photographer. To give you an idea, this is one of these ice rivers flowing across the Greenland ice sheet that's draining down. That's a person right there. So that gives you the scale. It's a pretty good-sized river. It's not as big as the Kennebec, but it's a pretty good-sized stream of water going very fast, headed for one of those holes, down all the way through the ice to the bottom. And what seems to be happening is this is happening a lot faster than anybody anticipated. Just 2 or 3, in fact, I was at an Intelligence Committee hearing, and I'm not going to tell you anything classified, but I can't remember exactly what the context was, but they handed out a big sheet of paper with pictures of the extent of the Arctic sea ice in 1980 and 1990 and 2010, and then they had 2010, and then they had projected 2015 and 2030. While we were looking at this during the hearing, I took out my phone, Googled Arctic sea ice, and found that in actuality the extent of Arctic sea ice today is less than what they were projecting it would dwindle to in 2030. The point I'm making is everything's happening faster than people thought. Okay. Oh, here we go. This is called the Jakobshavn glacier. Yes, the Jakobshavn glacier. It's the largest one in Greenland. And if you think of it, think of the ice sheet as a big hunk of ice, and then the glacier is like a river of ice. So the ice is leaving the ice sheet and then headed out the ocean. The West Greenland is here. See the icebergs here. And these lines are dates, and I don't know if you can see them, but this is about 1850. This is where the face of the glacier was historically, and this is today where it is. It has retreated as much in the last 12 years as it retreated in the prior 120 years. The glacier face keeps going back, and now it's actually in the ice sheet. This is basically like a fjord, and the ice goes out here and then breaks up and turns into icebergs. And in fact, they think that this is where the iceberg that sunk the Titanic came from, was from this glacier. But the point is, 12 years, it's moving 10 times as fast. 10 times as fast as it has historically. So, what does that mean? Here's another graphical representation of the ice in the Arctic Ocean. Again, it's pretty clear that something's going on. It stays through the 1800s, 1900s, gets out to about 1950, and then it starts to dramatically drop. When that ice leaves Greenland, the sea level goes up. When it leaves Antarctica, the sea level goes up. So I pressed John Englander and Bob Carroll, and I've talked to a group of other scientists since. What are we talking about here? A couple of inches? Here's what they said. A foot of sea level rise in the next 10 to 15 years, and a foot per decade thereafter for the rest of the century. Has that ever happened before? Yes. It happened during that melting pulse 8,000 years ago. A foot a decade. That is a catastrophe, my friends. It's going to be very difficult for Maine. It's going to cost us a lot of money to deal with, but there are places where it is going to be beyond spending money and beyond aggravating. Miami, a good deal of Florida, New Orleans, which is already at or below sea level, all the cities on the East Coast, Norfolk, Virginia, where we have most of our naval resources, are already seeing the effects of rising sea level. A point I want to make, and I probably should have said this at the beginning, this isn't a feel-good issue. This isn't a, I want to be a good guy and environmentalist and everything. This is practical, nuts and bolts protection of our country. If an enemy was coming and said, I'm going to destroy Miami, wouldn't we do something about it? Would we say, oh, that's okay, take it? No, we would marshal all of our resources to try to do something about it. Now here's another new term. Now they are having in Miami what they call sunny day floods. A sunny day flood is a flood of the streets of Miami and Miami Beach when there's no storm and no storm surge and no clouds and no rain. It's just the water's coming up. It's coming up through their drain systems. And Florida is in particularly bad shape because the substrate of Florida, we're lucky, we're granite. The substrate in Florida is porous limestone. It looks like Swiss cheese. So you build a seawall on top of it and the water's just going to come up underneath. Now, there are other national security implications of this, very much. That's why the Joint Chiefs of Staff some years ago said they felt that climate change was a very serious national security issue. It's what they call a force multiplier. Part of it is the simple physical risk to our assets, our bases all over the world and in the U.S., places like Norfolk and San Diego, Bangor, Washington. Did you know there's a place in Washington with the name Bangor? It's pronounced Bangor. They don't know from Bangor. But those places are all at risk. But here's the other risk. And this focuses on sea level rise, but of course going along with sea level rise is temperature. And as temperatures go up around the globe, and particularly in the equatorial area and a little bit north of the equator, you're talking about places that are no longer inhabitable. The estimates are that by the end of this century, we could see between 200 million and 1 billion people displaced. The Syrian refugee crisis is going to look like a tea party compared with that. We are going to see hundreds, tens and hundreds of millions of people on the move because the places they live they're going to be no water, no ability to raise food, and this is a national security issue. Again, it's not just feel good, it's not just environmental, this is very practical national security issue. Here's another way to look at the amount of ice in the Arctic Ocean. This is the volume change from 1979 to 2015. It's gone from 16,000 cubic kilometers to 5,000. Two-thirds. Two-thirds. Quite amazing change in the volume of ice in the Arctic. Two-thirds of the volume has been lost since 1980, as of September of 2015. This is this departs a bit from Greenland. Here's Greenland over here. This is the Arctic Ocean. And the Arctic Ocean throughout all of human history has been covered by ice. Covered by ice, pretty much year-round. The older ice is the white ice that's here. You can see it. And that's the ice that persists from year to year. So what you're going to see is an animation done by NOAA. You can Google, or you can go to YouTube. If you YouTube NOAA Arctic ice animation, you'll get this film. So let's play it. Starts in 1987. You can see it escaping down through the next to Greenland, or above Greenland. 1993, 94. The people listening on the radio now are really puzzled about what's going on. 2004. Watch. Remember what I said about acceleration? The last few years, now it went up a little bit in 2013. This year we don't have the final figures yet, but I think this year may be as bad as 2012. The point is, this is happening, and we've got to figure out what we're going to do about it. This beautiful ship sailed through the Northwest Passage this summer. First major cruise ship that I know of that's been able to do this. You could have gone, a cheap cabin was $90,000. You could have had one with a view of the ocean for $120, I think. I don't know why I missed it, but and then finally, here's I just thought I'd share with you a little bit about what's going on in the Arctic. This is Russia. This is what we don't usually look at it. Here's Alaska, Canada. Canada, when I was a kid, you looked at a map and you had the U.S. and Maine, and up above Maine there was this large white area. Now we know it's Canada. I don't know if you all know the definition of a Canadian. A Canadian is an unarmed North American with health insurance. Okay. Russia has the largest shore, and this is called the northern route, and that's the most clear. That's where ships are going through today. The Northwest Passage is along this side. It's less clear, and nobody knows. We can't say whether it's going to be clear in 5, 10, 15 years, but it's opening up. One of the reasons I'm interested in this is that this is an opportunity for Maine, because going from Asia over here through the Bering Strait and across the Arctic Ocean and to Europe or to the US, east coast of the U.S. is much shorter. I think it's 10 or 15 days shorter sailing than it is going down around the Suez Canal or through the Suez Canal or through the Panama Canal. So where are the first ports on the east coast of the United States if you're coming from Asia and want to go to the east coast? State of Maine. So that's one of the reasons that this is important to us economically and strategically. In fact, I got interested in this. Lisa Murkowski, who's my colleague, a senator from Alaska, we were walking into the Senate chamber. This was a couple of years ago, and I was right behind her, and I said, Lisa, I want to be the Arctic senator. And she said, no, you can be the assistant Arctic senator. So she and I formed the Arctic Caucus, and now there's a group of us that are interested in these issues because they're hugely important strategically. Russia is doing a lot of military buildup along here. They're important economically. They're important for transit. They're important, as we saw, for possible tourism. A lot of reasons the Arctic Ocean opening up is like discovering the Mediterranean Sea. It's a huge body of water that's never been there before, and now it's open to us. Okay, finally. Mary says I say finally too much. It gets people's hopes up. We've got to come to some understanding about what's going on. I think you can learn everything you need to know about environmental and ecological policy by knowing what I call the Maine rototiller rule. The Maine rototiller rule is very simple. If you borrow your neighbor's rototiller in the spring to till your garden, you give it back to them in as good shape as you got it with a full tank of gas. We have the planet on loan. We don't own it. We have it for a finite period of time. And we are turning it over to our children and grandchildren and their grandchildren, and we don't have the right to compromise it to the point where it's going to make their lives difficult, if not impossible. I call it intergenerational equity. It's an ethical and moral obligation to not ignore the results of what we're doing now that we know it. I don't blame somebody in 1950 or 1945 for not thinking about this, but now we know it. It's so clear, and it's becoming more clear every day. It's clear in the conduct of the lobsters in the Gulf of Maine. It's clear. Here's an amazing thing. There's an oyster farm I visited this summer in Damariscotta River where they grow these wonderful oysters that are used in restaurants all over the country. They have to grow the baby oysters on shore. They pump the water out of the estuary and have to put chemicals in it to buffer the acidity in the water in order for the shells to form. Because they don't form adequately in nature because the water has become so acidic because it's absorbing the carbon. It's creating carbolic acid. This is practical. This is happening right now. And it's going to affect us here in Maine, and it's certainly going to affect us all over the country. So, I think we have an obligation, first to understand the facts, and then secondly, to formulate policies, and not radical policies that will destroy our lifestyle or our quality of life, but rational policies that move us away from the combustion of fossil fuels, which are adding every day tons and tons and millions of tons of carbon to our atmosphere. Ed Muskie, one of my heroes, along with Peter Vigil. Ed Muskie. I have Ed Muskie's desk in Washington. How daunting is that? Ed Muskie used to talk, of course, he was the father of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, and he used to use, I should have done it here, he had a globe, an ordinary globe like you see in people's offices and everything. You know, a globe is usually a little shiny, it's coated with a coat of varnish. The thickness of the coat of varnish on a globe is proportionally the same as the thickness of the atmosphere on the Earth. It's very thin. It's very fragile. and we tamper with it at our peril. And again, I think we have an obligation to find solutions, and it doesn't mean stopping. We can't do that. We understand that. But it does mean having rational policies that lead us more in the direction of renewable sources of energy. I think solar is where it's coming because it's getting cheaper and cheaper. And to make decisions in our personal lives that will help deal with this problem. Unfortunately, the scientists say it can't be stopped. It's too late. This is happening. But we can slow it down, and we can perhaps make it less horrendous than it would otherwise be. The other thing we have to do is talk about how do we cope with this? How do we build things? How do we build things and think about, as we build things now, how are they going to last for 50 or 100 years given the likelihood of rising sea levels and the overall effects of climate change? So there are no easy answers to this, but I'm convinced that we have to continue to talk about it. I have to tell you, I was amazed and saddened that in 270 minutes of presidential debate, 3 90-minute debates, there wasn't a single solitary question, mention in any way of this, what I think is not the transcendent issues, but is certainly one of the transcendent issues. And if you look at it in a longer time frame than 2 years, it's certainly one of the most serious issues we've ever faced. So I wish I could end with something really uplifting and positive, but I will say this. President Kennedy once said, if people create the problem, people can solve it. And I think if we can come to a mutual understanding and start to understand not only the obligations we have to tomorrow, but the obligations we have to the people that will live 100 years from now in this wonderful place, we are going to find a way to do the right thing. I'll end with the words of Winston Churchill. Americans will always do the right thing, only after they have tried everything else. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator King, for those inspiring words. I'd like to now introduce Allison Eslin, who is a fourth-year honors student majoring in political science, psychology, economics, and at the University of Maine. She spent her spring semester interning in Senator Angus King's Washington, D.C. office as part of the Peter Madigan Congressional Internship Program, and she was selected as the Margaret Chase Smith Public Affairs Scholar for 2015-2016. She is a member of the 2015 Maine New Leadership Program, which is designed to educate and empower young leaders, giving them the skills necessary to become the next generation of civic and political leaders. Allison, we solicited some questions from students, and I think the floor is yours.
All right. Hi, everyone. I appreciate you all staying. I know we're going a little bit past. I have some questions from students who have been interested and wanted to pose them to the senator. I want to thank him for graciously agreeing to answer these. His time is very valuable, and we appreciate him being here with us. The first question I have here from students today is right on topic. Senator King, climate change has become an issue that causes division across party lines. As one of the few prominent independents serving in elected office at the federal level, why would you say this division over science exists, and how do you move past it to enact responsible policies that will protect our present as well as our future? So something nice and simple.
Yeah, and I think the question fundamentally is, why is this a partisan issue? Yeah. The answer is, I don't know. I usually don't need water. In fact, Lisa Murkowski, the chair of the Energy Committee, brought us some water one day. We were all drinking it, and it said Alaska glacier water. And I said, Lisa, I don't know whether to drink this or send it to the Smithsonian. Okay. I think it's because our society is based largely on a fossil fuel system, and we've got huge infrastructure and a lot of resources. I think it was Upton Sinclair said that the hardest thing in the world is to convince a person of a fact that's inconsistent with the way they make their living. And you know, that's the only explanation I can give. All of you know it's no secret that money is a big part of American politics today, and there's a lot of money in this area. Frankly, I'm a little surprised, and I think it's true of some of the big energy companies, that they aren't themselves getting into renewables and other areas instead of hunkering down and saying we don't believe in climate science. Unfortunately, there's a fair amount of evidence that there's been something of an industry of sowing doubt about this kind of thing, but I think the data is just becoming overwhelming now. It's so hard. I mean, you look at those first three graphs, it's hard to come to any other conclusion. But I think it's politics. It's come to divide the Republicans and the Democrats and the two independents in the Senate. But I will say, I sense movement on this subject among my Republican colleagues. They may not, I call them leaners. You know, you've heard of voters who are leaners. These are leaners. I think maybe something's going on. And I hand them my card, which I've handed to some pretty strong opponents. But I think we're going, now, the new president, you know, he's said it's a hoax. I'm hopeful that he's pragmatic enough to listen to the information, and perhaps we'll modify that position. I certainly hope so, because it would be tragic if we just lost all the momentum toward dealing with this issue.
Thank you. All right, so our next question. Neither the U.S. government nor its citizens seem to be responding to climate change fast enough to ward off some of its more drastic repercussions. Eventually, one way or the other, that change is going to have to take place. Where do you think it will come from? The government, while facing a resistant public, or the public will eventually demand that the government take aggressive measures against climate change?
Probably the latter. Probably the latter it's going to have to come from the public, and it's going to have to come, even people who see this compelling, powerful presentation, that's not going to be enough. They're going to have to see it in their daily lives. And I think when that starts to happen, then we're going to see some action. The other thing is that policy change often happens, nothing happens, and then suddenly there's a tipping point. And I sense that we may be close to that now. Now, whether or not the new administration, how that will play into this, I don't know. But I sense among both the public and the political folks that there's a greater and greater realization that we can't keep putting this off. And what the folks here, Paul Muskie at the Climate Center here, introduced to me the term abrupt climate change. Remember the meltwater pulse? That didn't happen over 1 million years. That happened over 1,000 years, and it was a foot every 10 years. And that's what we're facing, I think. And that's why there's an urgency to this. It isn't, we can't just say, oh, well, we'll take care of this in 100 years or let our grandchildren.
Excellent. All right, we've got a couple more for you, and then we'll release you. The next question is, why is your Free Market Energy Act the best approach to combating global warming? Free Market Energy Act.
The Free Market Energy Act? You mean the bill I introduced?
Yes.
Well, here's what the Free Market Energy Act says. It basically says you should have the right to make your own power. Pretty simple. Because what's happening around the country is, as people are installing solar, their own solar power, the utility companies see this as a threat to their, the historic way power was produced and sold in this country is big central generating plant, wires, and your house. And you sit in your house and take the power and pay. Now we have all kinds of new technologies. Solar used to be $70 a watt to install. Now it's about $1.80. That is a huge change, and now solar is pretty close to competitive. In fact, the lowest power purchase contract in the country in the last few years is a huge solar plant, I think in Nevada, or one of the, Arizona. But anyway, the Free Market Energy Act basically guarantees to people the right to make their own power and not be strangled. Now, there is an issue in this, and that is if you have solar on your house and don't pay the utility pays you, you don't pay them, then they have the fixed cost of the grid that you have to pay a little more because he's not paying for it. Do you see what I mean? There's a shift of the cost, and so I'm not immune to that logic. The question is, what's the right amount? What should people be paid for their solar, and how to pay for it and make it so that it maximizes its value both to them and to the grid. There's a value to the grid. Again, we get back to national security. One of the problems with our grid now is it's highly centralized. If everybody was making their own power, it would be self-healing. Do you see what I mean? You wouldn't lose everything at once. You'd have your own sources. I think the revolution that's coming is in batteries. And in an energy hearing where I was talking to one of the guys from the utility industry. By the way, that's the most fun part of my job, is the hearings where I get to go after people. Somebody said, "Why do you like it?" I said, "Because all my life I've been yelling at the TV. Now I get to yell at the real people." Anyway, what I said to him was, you're in a race with batteries. Because if you raise your charge so much to have the grid as sort of the backup to your solar, people are just going to cut the wires and put batteries in their basement. You see, they're going to say, "Well, and that's what's going on, and we're going to see a lot more than that. I think the utilities need to rethink their model and become more energy consultants to their customers rather than simply, here's the power you pay for it. And I get along. I was at Central Maine Power just a week or so ago, and I understand this cost shifting idea, but I think it's not as simple as yes or no. It's more subtle. But that's the Free Market Energy Act, which I introduced last year. It failed in the Energy Committee on pretty much a party line vote, but I'm going to keep at it. Interestingly, the first group to come forward in support of my bill was the Georgia Tea Party. The Georgia Tea Party, because they considered it a personal sovereignty issue. I have the right. Nobody should tell me I can't make my own power, which I thought was interesting. They call themselves green tea.
Excellent. Well, we have one last one for you here, and then we'll let you all go. And it's quite a doozy. Many Mainers feel quite cynical about the dominant political system, believing that those with economic and political power are not committed to participatory democracy in which we all have a voice. The 2016 presidential campaign, and now election, has only reinforced the cynicism and distrust. How can Mainers continue to work with Maine groups and individuals on these pressing issues largely outside this dominant political system, and at the same time have some influence over those with both economic and political power?
I'm going to try not to talk a half hour about this. But this is a deep question. One of the best analyses I saw of this election was heard a month or so before a couple of reporters in Washington who were covering the campaign. And they characterized it in this way that really struck me. They said these two people are running for president of different countries. Each is running for president of a different country. And as we saw with the results, those two countries are almost exactly the same size. I think Hillary Clinton got about 200,000 more votes out of 118,000. Almost exactly the same size. And if you look at those maps, you see the blue on the coasts, and then you see all this red. And if you look at Maine, you saw the same thing. That really bothers me. I feel that part of my responsibility is to try to figure that out and understand why people are feeling estranged from their government, why they are distrustful, why are they angry, and we need to address it. a friend told me what we need now is eloquent listening. I love that term, eloquent listening, to try to understand that. And I don't think I think it's a unwise, here I'm free to give advice to both parties, you see. I think it's unwise for the Democrats to say we're going to be the party of the cities and, you know, and a kind of enclave, and the Republicans, we're going to be the party of the rural areas. I think that's a mistake. And I was delighted to hear at 3 a.m. President-elect Trump talk about bringing people together. I hope that he meant it. But I think it's something we really need to think hard about, because we're not going to be able to solve any problem if we have this warfare between groups that aren't talking and listening to each other. And one of the problems, as I mentioned, is everybody gets their information from different places, and it's very hard to share. But it's something I intend to work on and think about, and in fact had a long meeting on it just on the way here. We've got to, and it's complicated. I mean, you all know it's complicated. The economy, it's economic. It's in part the collapse of the paper industry, or at least part of the paper industry. It's lost jobs, and part of it is government, but part of it isn't government. Part of it is just the world changing, and government is the target. Do you see what I mean? Everybody's mad at the government, but it may be that many of these things that are bothering people, the government has very little to do with. I think part of it is the inequality of income distribution that occurred coming out of this recession. Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump were both talking about essentially the same thing. When 90% of the income growth in 15 years goes to 2% of the people, that doesn't work. America has always been built upon a middle class where productivity goes up, the economy goes up, the stock market goes up, everybody participates. And statistically, that has not been true in the last 10 or 15 years, and I think we need to be thinking about that. So, a very good question, a good question to end on. I consider it one of, it sort of supervenes all these other issues, immigration or climate change or tax reform or any of those things. We've got to figure out how to talk to each other. And I love the president's image in his speech yesterday where he said, you know, what we just went through was an intramural scrimmage. We're all on the same team. And I think we have to keep reminding ourselves of that there's much more that we have in common than divides us. Thank you again for coming today.
So, Senator King, thank you. Thank you very much. Before we draw this Margaret Chase Smith Public Affairs lecture to a close, I have a small gift to give you today and a larger one that I can loan you.
Is it a rototiller?
No, it's going to require the Ethics Committee to allow us to loan it to you. But this is a picture of you holding the portrait by Margaret.
You can't see it, but I look about 12.
So that's a portrait that was painted by the Rockport artist Tom Piers, and the original is in the library, the Margaret Chase Smith Library. We're having a reproduction done digitally and then printed, and we'd like to loan it to your office. We just have to, before I can do the loan.
I would be delighted. I have a huge picture, a campaign picture of Margaret in the office. It's one of the first things that you see when you come in.
So we're working on that, and I'll work with your staff to get you the reproduced version of that.
Super. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks again. Thank you.